Good evening and welcome to The Square. Tonight's discussion is a very interesting one. We have a new segment for you called the Burning Issues Edition. Technically speaking, we'll be connecting more with our viewers. And in a nutshell, you tweet, you post, and we discuss it here on The Square by the resident panelists. As always, I'm joined by our resident panelists. My name is Danam PC. I'm the host of The Square. And I'll start with the resident panelist on my right, Charles Haba. Good to have you here.
Good to hear, Diana. How are you?
Good. Are you ready for the Burning Issues Edition?
Looking forward.
We're also joined, as always, by resident panelist Berna Namata. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much, Diana.
And Ephraim Rongbenje, great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yes. So like we say, tonight's conversation is basically a compilation of tweets that we've got on our social media feed over the course of the last couple of days. Burning issues, so to speak, that people have tweeted about based on current events and based on also other events that we'll be getting through in the program later on. But before we do, like we always do, we're going to have a midweek recap of some current issues that are very interesting. That especially, I think we're going to focus on one that happened today. Yeah. And I'll, Charles, yeah, start with it.
Yes, today the Supreme Court made a landmark ruling around petitions that had come to their attention, especially around defamation, caricature, adultery, cohabiting.
Issues that we've talked
in
depth about
on the square quite a number of times. And in the interest of the show, it wouldn't be very interesting. It wouldn't be productive for us to go into detail of all of them. But for me, two things stood out. Number one is that it was unprecedented that any mwananchi can come up and challenge the Constitution. In the beginning, the legal wigs of government tried to challenge the people who had brought that unconstitutionalism, and the judge ruled in favor of continuing to hear the case. I think that is number one, that even tomorrow as the Square, if we wake up in the morning and we decide that there's something unconstitutional, we should not fear that our move will be blocked. To me, that is one win by far. As to the details of defamation being decriminalized, and I think that's a huge step, especially around where people were worried that presenting a political case or a political situation or a politically connected person in an artistic way would lead somebody into trouble. I think that was really archaic. The one on adultery and cohabiting, I think the win on that one really is that the case can be withdrawn if any of the party decides to withdraw it. So I think it was good. Great legal strides for this country.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Brenda, if you want to weigh in on that before we get into the show.
I think, in short, it's always, like he said, it's always good to see that as citizens you can challenge the Constitution. And hopefully it begins something where, again, the desire is always that a country's constitution reflects the values of the people. And I think this is a good step in the right direction, at least in setting a precedent.
In setting a precedent. Yeah. Do you agree?
Yes, but I have a different...
Yes.
The malaria vaccine that was launched this week. We know that malaria continues to be a problem for under 5. So it's good to see some progress with research. Yeah.
All right, so we're going to start with the tweets of the people, so to speak. And our first tweet, we have a tweet from Honoré. Honoré, this is the first conversation I think we're going to have around this topic, says that my most burning issue, I would like you to discuss about that big house China gifted to Rwanda. Will it be beneficial for good or a trap in the long term? This is him talking about the tweets that are going to form the first part of the discussion. The second tweet is from Mugabo Joshua, and Joshua states that regarding the China-Rwanda relations, please consider discussing the communist political ideology transfer from China to Rwanda. 1, optics. RPF's strong relations with the CCP, the party. 2, increasing manifestation of humanism, the major principle of communism in our leadership. Yeah. And our third tweet, before we go to entering this conversation and hearing from all of you, resident panelists.
Yeah.
This third tweet is from Norbert. And Norbert says, well, in the tweet he states that China hands over an administrative office complex for the Prime Minister and other government institutions to Rwanda. This happened on Monday this week, as we all know. A project that China completed within 33 months at a tune of $27 million, approximately 25 billion Rwanda francs. So, we've heard you. We've heard your tweets. We've seen your tweets, and this is what we want to discuss. And I'll now just read a couple of stats, as you just said. It was a 33-month project, built to the tune of $27 million. So our criticisms have been put forward from this particular event that happened, this administrative complex that was handed over to Rwanda from the Chinese government as a gift. So some criticisms are, this is a neo-colonialist sort of agenda that China has across Africa, and Rwanda is not missed out on this agenda. Second is that there are actually some people on social media who are upset that the signage or the banner at the inaugural event was in Chinese and English, not in Kinyarwanda. I think we're going to weigh in on that a bit. And then there are others who are just basically saying, you know, don't look a gift horse in the mouth. This is something that was given to you as a gift. You don't have demands to you know, specific demands. That is naive, it's ungrateful, so forth and so on. So I'd like to start with you, Ephraim. This is something you've been vocal about. I remember the first episode of The Square, when we were discussing AU reforms, we talked about that building that was, again, gifted to the African Union by the Chinese government. So what are your views on this?
So, so a bit of context, right? This is not the first building we've been gifted. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs was gifted a building in 2009. And actually, funny, interesting fact is Minafet is right here. Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation is right here. And right next to it is this new building. So I'm assuming guys had extra land and they're like, you know what, let's build a second building. But jokes aside, I think...
I thought you were going to say they've created Chinatown.
I think for me, frankly speaking, the sentiment always around neo-colonialism, China coming in, doing this, I think it misses the mark, right? When you look at why these guys would do something like this, it's around, we see this happen all over. When you think of colonialism before, actually the structure of colonialism before independence of most of these African countries, very few countries or very few colonies received infrastructural investment. Very few. Infrastructural investment that to a certain degree was even productive. And the contrary to this is that when guys build you a building, they're not coming in to dictate administrative affairs. So for example, when they built Minafet, at no point, this is a gift from the Foreign Office of China to our Foreign Office. At no point did they say your foreign policy needs to be X. At no point do I even think that they used it against Rwanda to say you need to, it's more soft power. It's kind of like I bought you a gift to show you that I'm a friend or an ally. The same thing with this. Our Prime Minister's office is going to be there with other government buildings. I don't think these gentlemen are going to go in and dictate how it's run. So I don't think likening to colonialism or calling it neo-colonialism makes sense. I think it just misses the mark. I do want to say that it is an element to garner soft power within the region. You know, the saying is just as a reminder of who butters your bread. And I think that is very clear. Now, the issue that happened at the AU was that the building was bugged. This side,
it was fitted with secret microphones.
Pretty much, yes. It was fitted with secret microphones for somebody to eavesdrop. We don't know who, the Chinese government maybe. But I think in this day and age with smartphones and everything, you don't really need to build a building worth $27 million to eavesdrop on somebody's conversation. So I think that in itself is also not valid. I think what I look at is more the deal for the infrastructure, right? Because these guys, the contract that they signed with the government was a build, supervise the building, and then maintain the building. I don't know how long the maintenance contract is, but it's impractical, and Charlie will probably weigh in on this, but you cannot, as a developer, you cannot be or at least as a contractor, you can't supervise yourself, and then after that, you are the one handling maintenance after that. There's a reason why jobs are broken up and given to different parties to ensure that quality is maintained. And we can say this 10 years on from the Minafet building. It's a gift, and we thank again, like you said, you have to be grateful that you got a gift. But the quality of build, when we look at it, and the longevity of that structure is questionable. So these are things that I think the neocolonialism aspect, the bugging, the eavesdropping, and all of that, I think are not the real issues. I think the real issues are the contractual structures, or at least the way we've structured the contract in this context. Yeah.
Interesting. Yes, Brenda?
Somehow, you know, when I saw this on the agenda, I felt like we are falling into the trap of Western journalism or Western influence.
Because says the journalist.
Yes, honestly, because Africa gets gifts from all over the world.
Yeah.
So why are Chinese gifts always problematic?
No, the context in this, let's also add the context, you mentioned it. The uproar that we saw was also that the signage was in Chinese.
That's besides the point.
Without yeah.
I think that's besides the point. So one, Africa gets gifts from all over, okay? And perhaps we should add gifts, because it's not really free or no.
Not at all.
Yeah, there are tools or symbols for soft power, influence. So it's not really a gift. Two, I feel that when we look at what the Chinese are doing on the continent, the picture is mixed, and it depends on the local context. So I get uncomfortable when we discuss China and Africa as if Africa is a country. So there's a problem with that, because we know that in places where China, the local context is stronger, the conditions are better, you get a better deal from China. Anybody who has dealt with finance will tell you it's difficult, extremely difficult to borrow money from international finance institutions. Now, with China, it's much easier. You know, if we look at, for instance, the infrastructure deficit on the continent, if we were to follow the traditional way, the traditional partners, you know, if it's the World Bank, look at how long it takes the World Bank to approve a project. For once, we have a partner who's willing to say, okay, what do you want? What is in it for me? You agree? And you move forward. So for me, I think it's besides the point. You know, the Chinese, no, you need the road, right? You have the road. You need a building, you have the building.
But I think you both of you are saying, just very clearly, more or less saying the same thing. That whole infrastructural deficit in Africa and China coming in and actually
but don't forget, this is a conversation about China and Rwanda and the big building.
Yes. Let's focus on the tweeps.
So what I'm saying is that I think, back to her point, yes, we cannot have a conversation about China in its entirety. Again, in its entirety in relation to the continent, because it's a very complex array, and it's been there much longer than we have realized. You know, what I'm saying is that when you look at Rwanda and you look at the context of such buildings, even the institution, the Chinese institution that makes that investment, it's China Aid, at least for this particular building, it's China Aid, the same as US Aid and UK Aid. Those entities also spend a lot of money. Okay, UK Aid recently changed to I think it's forgetting the name, but you look at it and they put in a lot of money into the country, but they put it in a different way. What these guys normally do, the Western funds traditionally, they would go put a program up, at least for USAID, they will get what they consider a local contractor.
Entity.
Yeah, so these are people who have to be registered in the US, they have to have a DUNS number, and then they put forward a tender. So local companies can't bid. Then these guys get the jobs. Now, most of the time, the employees of these companies that have these contracts with USAID to implement certain programs, senior executives and management are American. So you find by the time there's anything that's done it's literally just trainings here, capacity building here, but most of the financial money that needs to go into the economy from these grants doesn't actually stay here.
It goes back.
It goes back.
That's what we know.
Well, I think The Chinese are also not any different from that.
But at least we have the building.
It is a game. It is a game that all of them will play. You will say the same about the Chevening scholars who are in our midst. They, at least we have. But I want to say two things. One, at the end of 2017, the government of Rwanda alone had a deficit of about approximately 33,000 square meters of office space that they needed, just as a government, for their own entities.
33,000?
33,000 square meters of office space that they need. Now, fast forward 2019, that building is complete in Chimihura. They've acquired another one across RDB and another one, I think, here in Kachiro on this KN2, if that's what it's still called, or Boulevard Ulumuganda. That has reduced the impact significantly without hurting the national treasury as much. So that is a very, very big stride in the right direction. So against that background, of course, you know, you'd say that it's going to hurt the private developers a little bit, those who have been cashing in on being landlords of tenants. That's going to hurt us a little bit. But it has solved a big portion. Issue. Yes, especially of government not spending as much, and they can go and spend in other priority areas, roads and health and what have you. That's gone. On the other one of what the French call cadeau empoisonné, you know, it's a gift that's wrapped, very nicely wrapped, but that may have a bit of poison in it. I think if you're to put things on a weighing scale, the good story would definitely outweigh the poisonous one, because in any case, what would it have taken the government of Rwanda to mobilize $25 million? 27 million.
An extra two.
An extra two maybe for the guy who did the deal. for that building to be put up. So I think let's let the criticism come with due caution.
I think I also want to touch on Joshua's tweet about humanism.
And just very quickly to add, we just didn't have time to also show his other tweet, but his other tweet was to do with religion issues in China, where there are human rights violations against Christians. Rwanda is a Christian country. How does this connect with this sort of relationship? So if you can weigh in on that.
Exactly. And I like Brenna's like no. I think. Okay, so the philosophy of humanism is actually a communist approach.
Yes.
So the idea is human values supersede religious beliefs. So simple things like abortion, right? Religiously, abortion is considered wrong for many reasons.
It's a sin.
Exactly, it's a sin. And then on the other side, human values, you're like, but there are circumstances where an abortion is needed to protect human values. And in many areas. So the belief is that Rwanda has adopted a similar philosophy. That's because that's at the heart of China's communist philosophy. So the idea is that has happened, and I think to a certain degree it's true. And he linked it to, and I thought that was really acute of him to notice. He linked the religious freedom to that. And I think from an outsider looking in, let me just say from a citizen looking in to Rwanda's approach to like church closures, banning this fellowship and worship during lunch hours in government offices. Because
these are things that, number one, they hinder productivity at work. Number two, the closure of churches, as we know, on the square, it was because it was a threat to people's safety. And
exactly. So now that is human values superseding religious beliefs.
Okay.
So I think at the heart of it, it's true. I don't know to what extent we infringe on religious rights. I don't know what the human rights lawyers would say about religious freedom. But I think when you sit down and you look at it purely just from that perspective, you realize that it's true. Like, you can't allow people to, even if they want to, you can't allow people to worship in a building that's going to collapse on them. Or you cannot force people to do something. Even if they want it, you cannot allow them to do it if it infringes on I would say on their safety, on a couple of things.
On their well-being.
Yeah.
So it was quite astute of him to link the two, the humanism value of, the Chinese Communist Party and Rwanda's sort of evolving
I think for the most part, when you when you look at the structure of our private sector historically, even when you look at our political economy, Rwanda echoes our country echoes a lot of like soft elements of China, in one way or another. But I think like one could sit down and do that for every country.
Yes.
But I think around those aspects, it's true.
I just want to make one point before we move away from that one, then around how in the future government can negotiate these deals better. It's extremely important that government stamps its foot when it comes to the quality that they expect. The final product at the end of the day is going to be consumed by Rwandese. So the point Ephraim raised earlier on should not go unnoticed. The fact that they will come, they will build, and then they supervise their own buildings, and then they'll maintain. No, that's totally unacceptable. At the end of the day, the product is ours. So you
think we should have better negotiating skills?
Better negotiating skills. Whether it's a road, whether it's a hospital, whether it's everything. I have a friend who worked at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs building, and she told me a sad story about leakages when the building was just a few years old. And I think it will be a shame if our Prime Minister is walking through the building that has just been awarded to him, and there's a crack in the wall 3 years from today. So I think we need to negotiate better. I don't believe in the old adage that a beggar has no choice. In this case, we're ending up with a product, and I also want to believe that there is a business relationship that they anticipate. And they will get that business relationship. And because they will get that business relationship, we should not end up with substandard products.
No, it's true. I can just say.
But we need to move. We need to move because we're going through a barrage of tweets and also other branding issues. And I would like us to go to our next tweet. And our next tweet is to do with Kwibuka and also the increase of local authors. And Brenna, this is a point you mentioned in our show last week. And I'll just start with our first tweet. Our first tweet is on a young man who launched his book yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, and moi le dernier tutti, that me the last tutti. Yeah, my French is atrocious. But this is by Charles Habonimana, and I think co-written with Daniel Le Scornet. And then our another tweet that I also want to focus on in terms of young authors, and Brenna, you weigh in more on this, is from Celine. And I think Celine launched her book last Friday, but one, if I'm not mistaken. And Celine, her book is called Untamed. And it's also, these are young genocide survivors who are, giving their testimony, but in a very, very admirable way. And Brenna, this is something you said when we were discussing Kwibuka last week and the week before, that there needs to be more literature coming out of Rwanda in terms of memorialization of the 1994 genocide in Rwanda against the Tutsi. So we have Untamed, we have Charles's book, Moi le dernier Tutsi. These people are young genocide survivors, and there's an increase in published works by youth, Rwandan youth. How do you think we can keep up with this momentum?
One, I'm glad that it's finally happening. We are seeing that more genocide survivors are coming up to tell the story, which is crucial. We also had actually Yolande Kagasana with It's Not My Time to Die, which was translated from French
into English.
Then we have Drums of Success. We have Hearts Among Selves.
Hearts Amongst Us or Ourselves, I think,
yes.
And, all these are Rwandans.
Yes, and all these Rwandans. Outside genocide, we have Small Country, which has actually won an international award. Our Lady of Nile, which has also won an international award. So we can see that there's potential. There's
basically
no doubt.
6-7 books in the at least this year. Well, from late last year until this year.
Yes. So there's potential. But again, we see that if you look at, for instance, the one that was launched yesterday by Charles, unfortunately I can't pronounce the French.
You're linguistically handicapped.
Yes, very much so.
Yes.
Me, the last Tutsi,
Yes.
by Charles. Charles had a co-author who is a well-established French author, which means there's also potential there for collaboration, because sometimes when you talk to some of these people, they tell you we don't have capacity, we don't have, but there's potential for collaboration. But again, we have to give them a push because it has to begin at home with the local publishers. Now, our publishing capacity is still really, really low.
We have a few local
yes,
publishers.
just a few.
Though.
Yes, just a few. It's Not My Time to Die. Who's a Press, took the lead, and we need to see more of that. But they cannot do that if they don't have the resources, because it's quite expensive to do this work. So, one, we need to support the local publishers and really make it easier for them to be able to do this work. Because if you're going to tell a story, what usually it would take is the writing of the manuscript. So for you to have it to a level where it will attract attention, it doesn't just happen to compete, you know. So this is where the local publisher will come in, because they will be willing to take the risk.
But to what extent, and this is the question I'm asking, because you said they need more support as local publishers to do this. The question is, are you saying that, because I know you mentioned this even last time with the institutions, and you said that they need more financial support. Are you advocating for a grant to be given to these publishers? Are you advocating for a nationwide grant for writers to tap into, and then publishers give them the support in kind?
Actually, I think all of the above.
I think it's both, yes, absolutely.
All of the deliberate inroads that are made by government, that are made by civil society to actually lift up our literary space. I think that's something that's coming up, but I feel like what's being shown by these writers is that they're doing the work. They're doing the work. There's been an influx of literature in the last 6 months, and then a lot of it coincided with the 25th memorial of the genocide against the Tutsi. But I feel for me this year has been this last year and this year, it's been quite exceptional in terms of the content created. And they have done the work. I really think the onus is now on civil society, government, or even philanthropists to tap into this and give them the support like Bella says that they need.
The other thing is, if you look at most of the books that have done very well, of course, they have a lot of international support. Your Land was in Belgium. It wasn't easy for her to actually get someone to partner with. But we know that back here at home, we have so many stories, and these stories have to be told. And this is where, again, we go back to the issue of empowering local publishers to be able to even address the issue of language. Because so far, it's much easier to have it in French or English. Yes, we don't have so much in Kinyarwanda. And we could even begin by translating the ones that we already have in English or French, Kinyarwanda, make them available. And beyond the local publishers, I think the schools have to, I don't know what kind of incentives can be given to schools to add these books on the reading list. Yes, on the reading list. Yeah. Because then you have so many young people interacting with these books, because it's not cheap to buy these books. Most of us are privileged to be able to go to a bookshop and get it.
Yes.
But we need these books to be available in schools where pupils, students do not actually have to pay for them.
I think
yes.
I'd want, obviously, sorry to interrupt you, Charles. I think for me, it's more of understanding that there's a journey, right? For the longest in relation to telling this, most people sharing their story, or at least telling the story. Let's say telling the story of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. You realize that it was being done by foreign voices. Now, the first step is, let us continue to tell this narrative, but from local voices. So that's the first step. So I think the language thing is the first bit. Until we have enough authors owning this story and sharing that story with the rest of the world, that's the first step. Then I think subsequently after then we can say, okay, then how do we share these stories locally amongst each other? Because I think orally we already have that. Unfortunately in telling the story internationally, it's not as easy to tell the story in an oral way, but we see it when we have the commemorations. People go, if you go for the vegan, people share their stories, and every year there's somebody's sharing, there's a new story you hear, there's a new version of this, a new truth you didn't know. And I think locally, even just locally in terms of sharing the story, we already have the systems. They may not be done through books, and I know eventually it will happen. Now, coming back to the conversation we had on the first show on the commemorations, we talked about the role of youth in preserving the memory. I think this is now where books come into play. But I don't think books are the only medium, especially when we talk about targeting the youth. We talked about this. We have people who share their stories via podcast, these visual content. There are many, even just simple blogs, So I think we are moving in the right direction and at the right pace. I think the first step is this international story. What are we communicating in terms of our international story?
Which is in process.
Voice? Yeah, which is in the process because with authors coming up.
Just want to say two things about that. One that respect is earned, is not given, and this is in respect to local authors and local content. So they have come of age that, despite maybe it would have been a difficult thing 10 years ago for what Bana is talking about, support from government and whoever cares to listen to support local content and local authors, they have had to walk a very rough road to prove that they are really worth their name. And they have proven it. You remember several editions ago on Reb, when we hosted the Reb guys here, and we took them on why they had banned the local publishers from supplying books to the schools. Yeah. So things like that do not help in any way in terms of promoting local content. That's one. Number two, back to local content. We have the stories. Do you guys know how many revolutionaries we have in Rwanda who have participated in the liberation journey from the last decades and decades and decades? Sometimes it is painful that we go to Rusororo and we see these men of honor off and there's nothing documented anywhere despite his wealth of knowledge. These very senior army officers who are retiring and now fading off the scene. You can imagine how much wealth of knowledge they have, and how interesting it would be to read a book from this war veteran of 45 years ago on what their journey home has been. So I think we have a huge opportunity that we are seated on that we need to exploit. Yes.
Just very briefly, yesterday the president of Ibuka highlighted a very key issue, which is still missing in the history books, the history of the persecution of the Tutsis, right from the 70s. Because
I think before that.
Yes, the 1970s, the 50s, that is lacking in history books. So as we plan to do more around publishing, I think it would be good to be very deliberate in documentation of this history.
I think just to touch on that, there's a really interesting book that was recently published, but again from a foreign author in relation to that. It's called Steeped in Blood.
Wallace.
Yes.
Wallace, yes.
It was. I think it talks about Akazu, but it also gives the political undertone to the persecution that happened right after independence. Actually, slightly even before. And I think it's very. I think it's. I'm saying this as a young person. I think any young person needs to pick up that book. It gives you. It takes the entire history and sums it up into one book for you to clearly understand the timelines and the context behind some of these things. And I think also it's just a learning experience also in the terms of quality of leadership and why it's so important that you as a young person, you need to work on yourself and your value structure, and why it's so important to put human values above everything else. And before you step into certain positions of power or influence, it's extremely important.
But I'd like to weigh in on what Brenna said. I'm really interested to see how these, these books that we're seeing that are being published in the last 4 or 5 years, how they can be integrated into our education system. Growing up in the high schools that we attended, we had literature classes. And his people. But just in the libraries, I mean, it was a space where you just go and get lost in books. I don't know how much, like you said, there should be a deliberate effort to have Rwandan authors in these schools and really make an incentive. I just wanted to reiterate that point because I think it's very important. So we're going to go to the next point, and the next point, next burning issue, so to speak. I'm going to address it to you, Charlie, because I think you're someone on the show who's been parroting, and I say it in a good way, institutional coordination. We've talked about institutional coordination on the show, but in this regard, I would like to talk about government communication agencies and how to build capacity in government communications, and I think this is a burning issue that we've never gotten around to discussing on the square. We keep on saying that government agencies in Rwanda do a lot of amazing work, incredible work, but more often than not, the capacity in terms of communication is not that adequate to put it out there, not only in Rwanda, in the region continentally, but also internationally. And Charles, this is something you've echoed a couple of times on the show in connection to institutional coordination. What are some of your solutions?
I'm not so sure I have a particular solution. If I had...
Maybe you can start with your context,
yes,
and then we work towards a solution as a conversation.
Or probably let me put it that way. If I was the appointing authority, I would set up a ministry of institutional coordination. Because that is how bad the matter is. And we've given quite a few examples of gaps in how our institutions work with one another. But let me put something in context around how government communicates. I am aware that in theory, to a certain extent, we have an office of the government spokesman, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs assumes that position. I think that alone is a challenge, because to what extent is a very busy man, like the person my good friend who occupies that big office, going to be able to communicate on behalf of the entire government? And I always like to give an example of the army and the police. They are the most efficient communicators we have in Rwanda, just because they have mastered the art of communication. They are officers that are in charge of communication will be spot on. They will tweet, they will have press conferences, they'll even break it down to units and of the different services. They do an extremely good job. But for instance, I was part of a Twitter thread during the course of this week around people complaining that their buildings and the character of their neighborhoods is being compromised because of non-effective communication or not very good urban planning methods. Now, it ran for about 3 days, and the mayor was being tagged. The city of Kigali was being tagged. Never did you see a single comment from them, yet their policies are being put to test. So,
and this was a local citizen.
Yes, it's a local citizen, and you'd go on and on. Now we've been talking about investors and how they struggle with laws that keep changing, and so I really feel that it is one area that we have not done too well in our business world. It is not uncommon that you get a building permit. To do a certain project, and when you wake up in the morning they tell you we have changed our minds. It is not going to be that anymore. Or
I think we keep on talking about the fluctuating environment of a regulation.
Lack of predictability, because you almost get the feeling that every head of every government institution wants to do things their own way, in zero cognizance of what their fellow leaders in the other institutions think about. So I'm extremely worried and pessimistic about whether there is going to be a light at that tunnel.
I just want to add to that. I think, so Charlie has mentioned two things. He's talked about communication with citizens and communication amongst themselves. Because we're talking about these institutions communicating, period. Now, I think the communication between themselves he gave a simple example of the police and the army. Mm-hmm. I think it's a structural thing. You know, like, I'll give you a simple example. Let's take the easiest way to see the manifestation of this communication. It's an unspoken code. When there's a military convoy or there are military officials passing by traffic police. No one has to write a memo or send an email, communicate, send a WhatsApp, make a call, no. There's a way somebody automatically sees something and says, I know what's up, this is what's supposed to be done, this is how it's supposed to be done, and that's it. And you see it happen so efficiently. So you find that even the military guys don't have to call in advance and tell all the police men on the road that we are coming. So it's a structural thing, because what happens at the end of the day, it becomes an unspoken but written code that you need to do this in such a situation. And I think that doesn't and
the accountability starts with you.
Exactly. And I think that doesn't translate in many institutions. Yes. So, for example, like you ask, this is a particular business process. I'll keep coming back to the private sector, because I think that's one where so many policies change, and understandably so, because we're still an evolving economy and country, and so many things need to be adjusted and fixed for that, to that effect. But what you have is that one day Rwanda Revenue agrees with RDB about a certain way to go about registration of taxes for newly registered businesses. But then what ends up happening is that, so for example, they'll say, for every registered business, this number goes into a certain database, and that person has to be contacted within 2 months to be invited for a training, and that's agreed upon. Then somewhere along the line, the physical budget of RRA changes and the training stops. So RDB is still collecting the numbers, but no one is calling the taxpayers. And what ends up happening is the taxpayer will be like, but Rwanda Revenue sending me a quotation to go to RDB. Why didn't you tell me when I registered my company? Like, no, but we agreed upon this with RRA. Please go to RRA. And then RRA guys are like, we were just told that we're not going to be doing this. Go back to RDB and find out. So you find there's that, and that's just a simple example. But what I've seen
when you say it's a simple example, you mean there's a more serious situation.
There are more complex
that affect drastically the ordinary person.
Exactly, and this comes down to
the livelihood of ordinary,
Yes, Rwandans, and this comes back to the regulatory framework. So we talked of the structure. That's what's needed to make it easier for this efficiency. But you see, with police and the army, the structures in which they operate, the environment, the ecosystem, is pretty static.
So are you saying like police and the army should go and train all government agencies?
Pretty much.
Share a certain code.
What I'm saying
transfer a certain code.
Sorry to interrupt you. I'll say it in a different way. I think all these government institutions should be run by policemen and soldiers.
very quickly.
Yes. No. I think we have to look at communication as a form of accountability. And as something that fosters transparency. And because of that, people should feel obliged to communicate and to explain things. And I have a problem because increasingly we're seeing some agencies that simply post information on Twitter, and that's it.
Or other social media channels.
on social media, and that's it. I don't think it's enough. Because most of the time, they'll probably post a tweet, and there's no follow-up if people are commenting or asking. There's no one to actually respond to the queries that are being raised. So we need to look at communication as accountability, as a form of accountability. If you're a government institution, you have a program that you're launching, you have to explain it. You have to be ready to answer the inconvenient questions that may arise, because sometimes you get a feeling that when you're asking for information, some officials feel like they're doing you a favor by giving you this information, which is utterly wrong in my view, because if you fail to get the communication right, trust me, even whatever you're planning to launch will be undermined. So we need to strengthen communication within the context of accountability and transparency.
And I know exactly where the problem is.
Do you now?
Is that it's because most of these leaders of the institutions have taken all the weight onto themselves. And you will go to most of these government institutions, they indeed have public relations officers. But two things about those officers. One is that they are either junior or they are not empowered, or that the leader of that institution feels that they are a threat to their visibility. That's where you go. How often do you see the Minister of Defense appearing in the media, giving press conferences and making statements? That's not his business. His business is strategy and bigger things.
Exactly.
They have a publicist. Yeah. So if you go to a huge institution like for argument's sake, RSSB or Ministry of
RDB.
Lands or whoever,
RDB,
why is it that the responsibility to communicate should rest on the PS or the Minister or the Director General? When is he going to get that time? So, Bana, don't complain that they don't come back to you. They have heaped on themselves the job of duplicating paper as well as planning for the country. And so, that is exactly where the problem is. Lack of delegating powers, because sometimes you even find these institutions have recruited very good resource. That they pay extremely well. And that sometimes they even headhunt from other institutions to come and communicate for them.
But then they
say, okay, fine, we have ticked the box. Let the guy stay there.
What's your take on this, Brenna?
Yes, absolutely. I think he's right. And the problem is also most of the time the technocrats have, worked on these policy papers. They understand the nitty-gritty. And so when you call the person on the top, they actually cannot go through the nitty-gritty because they didn't actually design the policy or they were not even extensively involved in the consultation process. So when you ask questions, they don't actually have the answers. So I think back to Charles's point, we need options. There should be options. And we have to do more to explain things, and look at it as a responsibility, not a favor.
Not a favor. I think, Charles, I mean, as someone who's worked as a communication specialist, as a consultant, as a comms officer, basically in the field of communications, one thing I think, and I'm happy to see that it's changing, but the level of empowerment you speak about, most institutions, when it comes to the communications department, there's a way it's just undermined. It's not taken as seriously. I think when you're developing policies, when you're developing technical briefs that have an impact on various issues, various elements of the country, trade, integration, health, what have you, education. I think people who are in charge of PR and comms should be part and parcel of those communications from the beginning. So that
and they should also be held responsible.
Absolutely. Yes. Absolutely. Given the empowerment to be able to talk on behalf of the institution, to so forth and so have you, as you said, Brenna. So I think that's something that I think it's changing, first of all, compared to a couple of years back, but it's something where people need to be given the weight in terms of owning these positions. Is there something you want to add, Efraim?
I think for me, it's hence sounding like a broken record, but I think we've talked about this.
Yes.
I always feel like there's a certain level of arrogance that comes from government. That is, it's a bit embarrassing to even see on national TV. But you find that you ask a leader. You see it's on social media. I don't want to name names or point fingers, but a leader is asked about something and they get defensive so quickly and they shift it almost like, trust me, I'm doing my job. And you're like, but it's not about trust. Like, if you truly believe in what you're doing, you should be able to explain it to us. And we're citizens. We truly want to understand why you're doing X, Y, and Z. I really don't want to mention names and but there was one incident that happened, and it was a decision that was so abrupt, and when things happen abruptly, like for example, if we wake up tomorrow and they tell you you cannot breathe oxygen, that it's abrupt. You'd be like, okay, why can't we?
Yes.
And imagine a leader telling you, we made the decision.
Trust
we are the leaders. We were picked for this job. Trust us.
Yeah.
Like no, like it doesn't. Government. The relationship between government and its citizens don't work like that. So I think for me, at the heart of this communications, because there's the communication between two institutions, but now the communication outward is that there's almost a point like we don't need to. There are some institutions and some leaders who are like, they'll be fine. We know what we're doing. Actually, they even say it's minuscule. Like it's not important. And then coming back to the empowerment thing, there's this huge vacuum because no one is being empowered to do the job.
Yes.
So I think once people humble themselves and acknowledge that actually communicating to somebody, it's like being in a marriage, for example. You need to communicate to your wife. I don't know. I'm assuming.
That's very different.
But you need to communicate to the person you're with and it's on a regular basis.
Absolutely.
When you talk to them, you're not doing them a favor.
Yeah. We're just going to go to a Twitter feed and just see if we have any tweets left, because we've been reading a lot of these tweets. And I'm seeing that there's a tweet from someone called Lionel. And Lionel's tweet is that, watching you from Kampala, at least you guys have such a good structure from the Chinese. For us here in Kampala, they're busy opening Chinese restaurants and bribing our officials left, right, and center for contracts.
We also have Chinese restaurants.
No, but
Is that happening in Rwanda?
I think at this point in time, we don't necessarily want to do comparisons.
Yeah, let's not do that.
But I do agree with what Bern has said. Like, the context of China's relationship across the across the continent, actually across the globe, is varied. I think somebody said this. I'll take another trade aspect. Somebody cracked a joke and said, if you want an expensive product from a Chinese, you will get it. If you want a cheap product, exactly.
So there are options.
There are options. Yeah. So it's the same thing even with some of these deals we have, these bilateral trade deals that we have, or just deals. You find that it's you get what you ask for.
You get what you ask for. But I also liked your issue, and I think we're going to take that into a conversation next week. Like these things of comparing, especially on a regional basis. I think we all know what I'm talking about. You know, the launch of these airlines, and there's some comparisons on social media that I think were a bit uncalled for. Let's all prosper. Let our air skies open to each other, and good for everyone. At the end of the day, I think that's a conversation for next week, most likely. I'd like us to give our closing remarks. Charles, I'm going to start with you on this, our first Burning Issues edition. What are your closing remarks?
Very interesting edition, first of all. I hope we can pledge to our viewers to have it at least once a month. It's very good. I do hope that whoever cares to listen, especially if there is that one institute. I know there's a gentleman we once hosted from the Prime Minister's office, and he actually told us that it was his responsibility to coordinate all institutions. I think he was inadvertently telling us, I am here, don't bombard me too much. We are not going to take the strides that we want to take as a country if we're not moving in the same direction. It's extremely important that if RDB is going to make all these initiatives with our commercial diplomats spread all over the world to bring in investors to come and build and do whatever they are doing, set up industries, that you don't wake up in the morning, you have gone, you've promised them titles, you've promised them all these things, and then you wake up in the morning, and then the guys at Lands wake up in the morning and say, no, you know what, we are here in the special economic zone, the maximum years we'll give you is a 20-year lease, on the backdrop of an investment code that allows them, much longer leases. So we need our government institutions to think in the same direction. If all this investment that has been done in the people and the things is going to be meaningful to the next generation.
And also, just to give respect, credit where it's due, I think a lot has been done in that regard, but still, more needs to be done. We don't benchmark ourselves against
continuous improvement.
And continuous improvement. Very quickly, we have a couple of minutes left. Ephraim, if you can just briefly give your closing remarks.
I think for me, at the heart of it is going back to the conversation about China. I think you get what you ask for. We need to, I think and that's the problem. Like we are too young to understand what colonialism looks like. You know, or at least let me take the pseudo intellectuals who believe who believe that they understand what it looks like. I think we need to step away from calling this relationship with China colonialism, because it simplifies it. It could be super beneficial to our economies, especially when you look at what we've talked about, that as you get what you ask for.
Yeah, and also to be in the driver's seat. Yeah. Bernard, very quickly, closing remarks.
In relation to promoting reading and writing, I think that we need a national day for Rwandan authors. A day where we can just talk about Rwandan writers, Rwandan literature, because we have an international day. But I think it would be good if we, at national level, we come up with that day where we just appreciate our...
And celebrate.
Yes, and celebrate. And then the last one, Charles yesterday said, I will die tomorrow, but I know Charles will live forever. And that was very powerful because...
Charles Habonimana.
Yes, he's published. Like he says, even if he dies tomorrow, we can still make reference.
Yes, very powerful.
Yeah,
very powerful.
Very powerful. So for every survivor, anybody with a story to tell, I think that should inspire them.
Absolutely. And thank you for reading us that quote from Charles. We've come to the end of the show. Thank you very much for joining us on our first segment of Burning Issues Edition. We're planning to do this once a month, where we connect more with you, and a discussion of the show is literally formed by your comments, your posts, your tweets on social media. Thank you very much for tuning in. I'd like to thank Uzi Collections, our partner, as well as Bourbon Coffee. Thank you very much and have a good evening.